Hello, lovely listeners. How delightful to have you here. This is your regular archaeogastronomical adventure, The Delicious Legacy, where we're wandering through the deep past and in distant places, exploring the delectable culinary history of our curious ancestors, unraveling the taste of dishes that will excite us, shock us, and make us cook them. I'm your hungry and very curious host, Tom Dinas, ravenous for over 40 years. I often think about China and the massive civilizational achievements of this vast, diverse and magnificent country. And as you might have guessed, I mostly dream about Chinese dishes, food and long-lost recipes too. The myriad dishes with pork, the fantastic use of soy sauce and bean pastes, fermented foods, sweet and sour tastes, tofu, noodles and probably the million things I've left out in this introduction. Now, I wanted, for ages, to do an episode about ancient Chinese food and general food history in China. But of course, one episode alone won't do justice to the 5,000 years of history. How to condense it to such short timeline, that of a podcast, and maybe one episode, and keeping all the essential info in. Luckily, very recently, a rather exciting book came out called China in 7 Banquets, A Flavorful History. It was published and contained, beyond my wildest expectations, all the elements I wanted to explore and bring to you. A pleasurable adventure and deep dive into the long history of Chinese food by Professor Thomas DuBois. Surprisingly, or on the contrary not so, nothing similar in the English language was out there before this in June. I had to get in touch with Professor and talk to him, question him, interrogate him on all the myths, misconceptions and finer details of Chinese food that simply we, here in the West, might have missed through all the noise about Chinese technological ascendancy and the unprecedented economic growth. Professor Thomas DuBois' book is gorgeous. A lot of fascinating details through the records we have of China's ancient past, with recipes, dishes and overall food etiquette, accounts of imperial palaces, from merchants and religious texts, correspondence between emperors, traveler journals, agricultural manuals, medicinal texts. All these records paint a rich, diverse and above all, delicious history, worthy of exploration, not in 1, 2 or 3 episodes, but a whole series, to be honest with you. And of course, the above doesn't just give us all our answers, but raises further questions too. How did the food change through the millennia and through contact with the rest of the world? What role religion played, and especially Confucius, and later the spread of Buddhism? How the food differs from north to the south, east to west? And is noodles and pasta in general a Chinese invention? Obviously, I wouldn't dare to take Professor Thomas DuBois' time for 5 or 6 episodes about Chinese food, but we sat down and we talked for roughly an hour, trying to explore these themes from his book. So sit back, relax and enjoy this new adventure, this fascinating interview with Professor Thomas DuBois, all about his new book, China in 7 Banquets. Professor Thomas DuBois, welcome to the Delicious Legacy podcast.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure and honor, and I'm very excited to have you here. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? What do you do? And a little bit about your new book.
Okay. I am a historian. I'm a historian of modern China, and I live in China, which is relatively unusual for my profession. I've been here since just before COVID, so I've been here for about 6 years, but the first time I came to China was in the early 1990s, 1992. So as a historian, I could say that I'm living history. I've been here for about 30 years. My first work was about religion. And to learn about religion, I went and lived in a village for a year and looked at everything they did and everything they thought and talked to as many people as I could. I worked on religion for my first 3 books, so about 20 years, and then decided it was time to move on to something new. And that something new was food. The way I got into food was, all these things happened by chance. I went on a trip to Inner Mongolia and just fell in love with the place, the culture, and the food. And the food in Inner Mongolia is very different from the food you would get in the rest of China. China is really a farming culture traditionally. Inner Mongolia is a pastoral culture. So suddenly I'm, eating a lot more beef and lamb and consuming a lot more milk in various forms. And this, after a couple of decades in China, to be surprised like that was a really exciting experience. So that sort of pushed me in this direction. And that was about 6 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been in food history with enthusiasm ever since.
Excellent. So your new book is called China in 7 Banquets.
Yes.
And
A flavorful history.
a flavor history. Yeah.
The book was started by accident. Usually, when you write an academic book, you have a structure and you have a thesis and you have a grand scheme of things you want to do. This was not how I wrote this book. I just sat down. I just collected notes and started writing little things for myself. And a lot of my notes were cooking notes because I collect old recipes. And I would find an old recipe and I would try to translate it. That's a skill you have to acquire because the vocabulary and all of this are very different from modern Chinese. And I would take notes on what I was doing right, what I was doing wrong, what I understood or misunderstood. And those notes, as they got more and more, I thought, there's a big story here, and it's a story nobody else has told, and it's the big picture story of Chinese food, really with an emphasis on cuisine. So that part is quite new because it started in recipes and grew out from there.
Brilliant. So obviously you write about food history, Chinese food history, but also you talk. So the book has 7 chapters, let's say, right? And you cover a lot of this vast history of this vast country. So it's difficult. It's an exquisite book. It's amazing. So much information trying to be condensed in in like less than 300 pages, but it has a lot of information, which is great. And you've done a really good job on trying to condense all this history in there and all this flavor history, as you say. But obviously, in terms of food, do you think we in the West or outside China, do we know a lot about Chinese food and Chinese food culture, dishes and stuff?
No.
We
don't.
I thought so myself.
I like I said, I've been here since the early '90s, and I'm a foodie, as we would say, and any social interaction, including my field work. When I was working on religion, there was always food. So if you want to make friends with somebody, you cook with them, or you eat with them, or you get drunk with them, or goodness knows what. So I've been doing that for a few decades, and it was only when I sat down to look at some of these things systematically that, really sort of, you have a sort of a common sense knowledge about how do you eat or whatnot, little things you pick up. But systematically making it into, let's say, a book chapter, there was so much that I didn't know. And interestingly, it's not just that we in the West don't know a lot. It's that a lot of things they've kind of fallen off the map of common knowledge in China. So just very briefly, I'll introduce the 7 chapters, 7 banquets. That was an idea that came to me one night. Each banquet is an individuated story. So the first chapter is Ancient China, and that is talking about things like morality and the foundation of Chinese philosophy, how it relates to politics, how it relates to personal morality, and all of these things are expressed through food. And so the banquet is a political banquet that is written about in the Confucian texts, in the Confucian classics. The second one is the Tang Dynasty, that's the Silk Road. And that story is how did new ideas and new foods come to China? So each individual, onions are not native to China. Garlic is not native to China, any of these alliums. So they came from somewhere, and when they came from somewhere, they made an impact. Dairy, for example. And the reason why dairy and onions and all of these things, they all came from the West. And the West doesn't mean Europe. The West means Central Asia or India, like sugar that came from India. The reason they all came from the West is that was where the Silk Road was connecting. So the second banquet is a Tang Dynasty cosmopolitan banquet I think it was from the 9th century. The third one is talking about the high cuisine of the later dynasties. So the Song dynasty, the Ming dynasty, and the Qing dynasty. So roughly 1000 to 1900. So the later imperial period. And that uses literature as one of its banquets. But there are also a lot of court banquets that I talk about, because this is the high culture. This is late empire. The next one goes to the 20th century, looks at Shanghai. It looks at when China joins global food chains and what that does. So it's not just, that you have Western food. It's that you have Western food in the context of global trade. That's a different thing. That's from the 1920s. Then we come more towards the modern day. We have one from the 1980s. That's actually taken from a movie, and it's showing how all of these economic reforms are changing society and changing food at the same time. And then the last two are one from the present day. That's taken from an app on my phone, and that's talking about how delivery and food delivery and all these are totally changing everything we know about eating. And then one from the future. This is where I speculate on where food could be going. So that's a very long introduction to the book, but the ideas behind it, each one is a different story, and they show something. So the question was, do we understand Chinese food? What is Chinese food? So when you look at it in this 4,000 year perspective, everything has changed. Going from the ancient to the Tang Dynasty, there are some dishes that show through, some cultural ideas that remain intact, but everything is different. And then, going from there to, say, the 1920s, you wouldn't have understood this at the time as a Chinese diner. It would have all looked so strange. So this is one thing that really has struck me, is the fundamental question of a book like this, when you're looking at big change over time, is, okay, what are we going to define as Chinese food? And I came to an answer to that question. It's not spices, it's not individual dishes, it's not, individual cooking methods. I think it's an underlying philosophy. And that philosophy is something that isn't really even that visible in China right now.
Right. Obviously, you cover a lot of the past history, but what is interesting and fascinating with your book is also you're covering now, what's happening now. So it's a current history and also future. So that's kind of unique thing that we're going to talk about a little bit later in this episode. But before that, I want to ask you, so let's go back in the past a little bit. Let's go to the deep past. One of the fundamental things that I always try to find out is recipes or dishes. Do we have written records of specific recipes and dishes and how these are manifested? Like, for example, from the ancient Greek world and Roman world, the recipes were very vague. Take this, X, Y, Z, and you make the dish. There was no quantities, exact quantities, for example, or how many hours you cook in something. How is the Chinese recipes, if they exist from the past?
Exactly the same. These are, the sort of like the notes that one grandmother would tell another grandmother. Cook it until it's done. Add enough salt, but don't add too much. This if you're an expert, this makes perfect sense. And the people reading these books were very likely experts. These are crib notes for people in that profession. It really isn't until the 1920s that modern style cookbooks, 1 teaspoon, 1 cup, 5 minutes, this kind of thing, that these come into vogue. And the reason is because now you have a change in the way people are living. You have housewives. You did not have this before.
Absolutely.
And the ones from earlier, there are so many. I have a library of recipes. And I think that was one of the frustrations of this book, is that I included 80 recipes, and that does not represent 1% of the recipes that the ones that I have. And the ones that I have are only a small percent of the ones that exist.
Okay, you are whetting my appetite now and my curiosity. So I guess there's a lot of future books then.
I hope so. I hope so. There's a lot of material.
Yeah, excellent. So you talked a little bit about this long history. So what else is fascinating? What's exciting from the past, from the ancient Chinese food history, basically? What makes you?
There are certain periods of time and certain recipes that really sort of strike a romantic tone. One of them is the very ancient recipes. It's very similar to ancient Greece. Meat has a very important place in not just Chinese culinary history, but in religious history, because a lot of the meat was coming from sacrifices. And, gifts of meat were one of the very earliest diplomatic protocols. So if somebody gives you a gift of meat, and it could be preserved meat, it could be cooked meat, it could be raw meat, this is an expression of a superior offerings. It's something that you offer down. You don't offer meat to a superior, you offer meat to an inferior. And this is, these hierarchies are fundamental to Confucian diplomacy. If you accept the meat, that means you are accepting this relationship, that I'm your guy. And so there's, something in one of the Confucian classics that somebody offers a gift of meat to Confucius and he says no. And the reason he says no is because I don't want to be your guy. I don't want to be your employee, and because I don't respect you. Okay. And so, it seems like a small thing, but then you go through and you start to see how important meat is. It just runs through everything. And that then comes to these 8 recipes that make up the first banquet. And the 8 recipes are actually really detailed in the way that they're described. You could make them if, it takes some trial and error, but I've made about half of them. There's one that I'm not going to make, which is dog liver, but the rest of them I have made. And you don't know anything about the taste, but you are literally bringing the ancient world to life in your own kitchen. That's extremely exciting. One thing that I did get a new appreciation for in making some of these recipes was fermentation. Now, soy sauce is, of course, fermented. Soy sauce is the late product. Earlier products would just be a fermented bean paste.
Yeah.
But before the fermented bean paste, you made fermented meat paste. And this is called hai. And it's similar to garum, the ancient Roman garum, or shrimp paste, or fish sauce that you would get in Southeast Asia today. And that is one thing I have not made, because I would be immediately thrown out of my apartment because I have a feeling it would stink.
Yeah.
But I've made all the fermented bean, a number of fermented bean recipes, some that do appear in the book. But these base flavors, the ones that would become sauces, these are pretty magical, actually. And I think if there is a way to recreate these, I would run the risk of stinking up an apartment. I would run the risk of getting evicted from my apartment if it could really make something that is as good as I think these must have tasted.
Right, yeah. I'll be back after this short break. I mean, yeah, fermentation is a whole other world. And of course, as you say, you can ferment and pickle so many different things. And we can talk for hours. And I think we start finding a new appreciation for these techniques nowadays, at least between the world of foodies and chefs and writers, I think. But we barely scratch the surface of that, I think. So yeah, there's so much there from the ancient world, from ancient China. One thing that strikes me, and it's kind of fascinating, and I'm always trying to bring it together whenever I have an episode talking about food, obviously, and ancient food, how interconnected humanity and humankind was always. It's not just today's in the modern world, but we always exchanged ideas and obviously goods, and hence that influenced one culture and another culture. And I'm always interested to find the connections between the world. So, like ancient Greece had, and Rome, of course, fish sauce and the sweet and sour element and pickled. And am I wrong to think that there was similar ways of cooking and combining the flavors with in ancient China?
Oh, absolutely. There were a number of, you could say, zones of interaction. One of them is the South China Sea that develops over time. Another one is any of these river systems. Another one is the grassland. So people talk about the Mongol Empire. Really, there was the Silk Road. And then a few hundred years after that, there were the Mongol invasions. The Mongol invasions connected the world. And so, you had people in China coming from Iraq, and, they're bringing their culture, they're bringing all of their spices. So, I'm finding things like my family is Palestinian. I'm finding things in these, the dynasty is called the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol dynasty. So the early 1300s. I'm finding recipes in these Yuan dynasty cookbooks that sort of like, wait a minute, my mother makes this dish.
Wow.
It is Arabic food. And, it's just a matter of sort of forensically reading these recipes. And it's like, it literally, for example, there's the dish of stuffed eggplant. This is a dish found in a Yuan dynasty book of medicine. You cut eggplants in half, you fry them, you core them, you par fry them. So briefly fry them, not done. Then you add meat and sesame, stuff it back into the eggplant, cook it again in yogurt, and add pine nuts over the top. If you replace yogurt with tomato, that is a dish that I have eaten since I was 5 years old.
Yeah.
That's a dish that's eaten throughout the Middle East. And the reason you're replacing yogurt with tomato is because tomato, of course, came later. So yogurt is taking the place of this umami-driven sauce that now the most common one is tomato, but before that, it was all dairy-based. So the idea that you're eating eggplant with lamb and pine nuts cooked in a yogurt sauce in China, in a Chinese cookbook, that's not the Chinese food I thought I knew.
Yeah, absolutely. And it brings us more in touch and finding these common elements from each culture, basically. That makes it not so alien anymore, makes it, you can connect and understand the people and their history and their culture, I suppose.
And you can see a lot of these things today. A lot of the really ancient recipes you would see in the far south of China, in the mountains, areas that are sort of ethnic minority areas that preserve a lot of very, very ancient culture. They still do have, you can buy pickled meat.
Okay, yeah.
It's still made in these areas.
Briefly, pickled meat, I mean, obviously that piques my imagination, curiosity. So what meats do we talk about? Any kind of meat?
Any kind.
Yeah.
And in the sources, they would say that because this is diplomatic, it's books of protocol. So they're saying that a king has to have this many dishes. When he receives a guest of this or that level, has to have this many dishes. And the largest number would be 60. 60 different kinds of fermented, salted, or pickled meat.
Okay.
So we've got things coming from the sea. They're coming from land. It's
game,
the more the merrier.
Yes. Yeah. Poultry, game.
It's
everything.
Anything that could be pickled was pickled.
And yeah, I mean, that's something we don't do in the West, at least anymore. Could you describe, I suppose, the flavor profile of something like that?
I'm sure you know kimchi,
Yeah.
Korean kimchi. I have had this one I bought. And one thing I should also add is because I've lived here so long, one of the things that I've done, I went to cooking school. So I have made a lot of friends in the industry, especially a lot through social media. So I was researching this pickled, it's not pickled, it's fermented, researching this fermented meat and said, you know, I must try this.
Yeah.
Where can I get this? So I started asking friends, and they started asking friends. And in the very far south, a place called Guangxi, way up in the mountains, they said, we know somebody who does this, and they sent me a pot of this. And it arrived at my home. And this is during COVID.
Wow.
So I could go nowhere, but I could have this delivered to my front door. And it was like the difference between pickled cabbage and kimchi. So pickled cabbage or salted cabbage is a flat flavor. Kimchi is a multi-dimensional flavor.
Yeah.
The fermentation process completely changes the texture of the cabbage, it brings out tastes that could not be created any other way. And the pickled meat versus salted meat, which salted meat you can get anywhere, or pickled meat you can get anywhere. And this fermented meat, I keep calling it pickled, this fermented meat, it's the same kind of difference. It's 4 layers deeper in the flavor profile.
Yeah, you expand your dimensions from a 3D world.
Yeah, we have no vocabulary for this, but it is amazing stuff, and it does not stink. That's Excellent. One thing I should front and center.
Yeah. I love it already. Yeah, so that's very, very exciting. As we said, China is a huge country. It's a varied country, geography to ethnic groups to everything else in between. So obviously, we in the West, we know a lot about rice. We know that rice is fundamental to what we think as a Chinese cuisine and culture. But also, that's not the only thing. Like they have millet, I believe, in the north. So millet was more prominent, and I guess the whole soybean concoctions with the soy sauce and the fermented beans and pastes and tofu. So all this culture, how it varies from place to place. Do you have some examples that we can touch, like north, east, west, south?
The big picture, if you're drawing maps of China, we talk about the sort of the north-south would be, first of all, China has 2 big rivers. It has the Yellow River in the north, going west to east, and has the Yangtze River going west to east, but further south. The Yangtze River is kind of the north-south dividing line. And that is the one that goes basically to Shanghai, starting in the Himalayas. North of the Yangtze River is more dry, and that's typically, as you said, a millet area, millet and wheat. So this is where you get noodles as your primary grain. South of that, it's more wet. It's of course warmer, and so that's where wet field, flooded field rice becomes the main grain. So that's one difference. That's one north-south: dry land agriculture, wetland agriculture, millet in the north, rice in the south, and that has been the case since the Neolithic, and it's still the case now. But that's not the only one. You've got more grassland in the north and less grassland in the south. You've got, if it's wet, you can do aquaculture. So seafood is more in the south, especially mutton is the primary meat in the north. And then over time, pigs become the main protein. But it's more in the south than in the north because pigs need a lot of water. So that's another difference. You could say you've got the millet rice line. You've also got the mutton pork line. You've also got the cabbage lettuce line.
Right.
So if you go to the south, you get a lot of really sort of fresh herbs and lettuces, different kinds of lettuces. In the north, you're really more cabbage based because of, again, the climate. As far as taste, the north is of course going to eat saltier food because we have to preserve a lot of things. And then that becomes the taste that people become accustomed to. So more pickles, more fermented things, more soy sauce. If you talk about Shandong food, so there are the four main cuisines: Cantonese, Sichuan, what's called Huaiyang, which is just basically the Shanghai area, and Shandong, Lu. So Lu, Chuan, Yue, Huaiyang. Those are the four big cuisines. Lu in the north, Shandong, where I am. I'm in Beijing, but it's part of the Lu Cai area, is salty, heavy, meaty, lots of soy sauce. Brown is the basic color of food. If you go to the very far south to Cantonese food, it's subtropical, of course.
Yeah.
It's a much lighter taste. And the reason it's a much lighter taste is because there's much more emphasis on the quality and seasonality of the ingredients. So Cantonese food is famous for fish, and dozens and hundreds of different kinds of fish and different types of seafood prepared in very different ways, because that fish has been acquired locally.
Yeah.
And it's perfectly fresh, so you don't have to do anything to it. And then over in the far west, Sichuan is, of course, known for spicy food, but actually that's where I studied. That's where I went to cooking school. And it has a reputation that everything is hot. It's just that one taste. And that is not true. That's for the tourists.
Fair enough. Yeah. Well, someone had to acquire that that reputation, as like you do with Mexican food. It's supposed to be spicy or whatever. Indian, yeah.
Very good comparison. Mexican food and Sichuan food, and the misunderstandings around both of them.
Yeah, exactly. The misunderstandings. It's the important bit. So in terms of, you talked about the very fresh produce from the south and near the sea and the coastal areas and the rivers. So you have very fresh food. You have also the love of spicy. This love of spicy food and spices was always there since Confucian times, since ancient China, or is that something that gradually became part of basically the medicinal texts and the health and all that complex philosophy, let's say, of one's health?
The health is really, this is another world. This is what I want to do in the next book, is to talk about health and seasonality and the medicinal uses of food, because that really is its own universe. It's incredibly rich. The spices are interesting because you see them coming in one by one. So one of the very earliest spices is ginger. That's always been there. And apparently Confucius liked ginger. That's, he's known for elite tastes, means when you talk about flavors, and particularly in the context of philosophy, I would say it's probably very similar to the ancient Greeks, in the sense that you can judge a lot about a person by the taste that they want and the way that they eat. And so a measured person does not gorge himself on meat, but he also doesn't starve himself as an ascetic. The same thing with flavors. So the 5 flavors is a metaphor for a balanced person. You don't want too much sour. You don't want too much salty. In particular, a balanced king. So eating correctly is much more than just what you're in the mood to eat right now. It has a much deeper metaphoric meaning. Those were ancient. So when these spices came in, each one sort of had its own debut, and it made its own mark on the cuisine. So the very earliest one was ginger and Sichuan peppercorns. So Sichuan peppercorns are a misnomer because they're actually from North China, and they're not peppercorns, but they're used in Sichuan cuisine, so that's the name we use for them today. After that, you had garlic and onions. Those came in later from Central Asia. The high cuisine of what we can call the medieval period, say the Song Dynasty, had a lot of spices that we don't see today, like long pepper. A lot of them that don't have names in English because you wouldn't see them in an English-speaking setting. But where you would see them is in a Chinese pharmacy. Chilies are probably the latest to arrive. Cumin came in from Central Asia, to ones like that. Pepper, just regular white pepper or black pepper, it was known in ancient China, but it really only came in large amounts when trade opened up with Southeast Asia. So it's not just a matter that the spice is there, but can you get it in reasonable amounts? That's relatively late. That's maybe something like the Ming Dynasty. Chilies were the game changer for a lot of places. Again, particularly in the mountainous areas. The reason chilies are interesting is they're a salt substitute, and salt, just like it was in France, was taxed. So if you're up in the mountains and you're relatively poor, you don't have much salt in your diet. And so chilies were used to replace the taste of salt or extend the taste of salt. And even now, the places that use a lot of chilies tend to be southern mountainous areas like Sichuan, for example.
Okay, thank you for listening. Here we shall end part 1 of our talk. Please join me next week where we discuss more fascinating chapters of Chinese food history. Before I go, I want to tell you about today's gastro recommendations, which are Pit Magazine, which is a bold, thought-provoking magazine that challenges the obvious narrative across a wide spectrum of food topics. It's an award-winning magazine from the Guild of Food Writers, and you can find more if you go to pitmagazine.uk/about. So find out about the next theme. On top of that, I want to recommend the podcast The Full English by Lewis Bassett, which is covering themes about British food and British history and social history and how things change through the ages. And the delightfully named Into the Curd-verse, a podcast about cheese by Lisa Kaywood. And you can find her on Twitter or X at Curd-verse, one word. And of course on Instagram at Into the Curd-verse, all one word. So it's a podcast about cheese and all the things that you want to know about cheese and you're afraid to ask. And my final 10 news, not perhaps so 10 news, but gastro recommendation that has to do with food and nature and history is the book Nature's Ghost by Sophie Yeo, which is published by HarperCollins recently, and it's generally about how humans alter the environment for good and bad, of course, uncovering the stories of people who have helped to shape the landscapes that have been lost through the millennia, and how these landscapes basically fed us, but also helped or hindered nature, and how we are uncovering them nowadays, and what that tells us about the future. How can we feed the world and protect nature? So yeah, this is Nature's Ghost by Sophie Yeo. And that's it for today. Thanks for listening. Remember to give us a like on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, YouTube, follow the channel on YouTube, and leave a review if you can. That helps a lot the podcast climb up the charts, so to speak, and being more recommended to other people too. We have a few exciting interviews coming in the near future. And on that note, I've been Thomas Dinas, and this was the Delicious Legacy Podcast. Thanks for listening. See you next week with part 2 of Chinese food history.